All right, so we're going to pick up where we left off before. We ended with the conclusion, or not the conclusion, but the unification of Japan under the Tokugawa shoguns. This is going to kick off a time period where the Japanese are going to start to come into contact with a lot more outsiders, and there's going to be a push for modernization. During this time period, we're going to see attempts by the Japanese to keep outsiders out, like we saw in China, but eventually they're going to open up, and eventually they're going to make decisions to modernize, and Japan's going to go through a lot of flux during this time period. There's going to be a lot of changes that are going to take place. So, first of all, Japan is opened up by the Americans. Commodore Matthew Perry is going to come to Japan, and at this time, the Americans are still pushing through this whole idea of manifest destiny on the continent, the idea of expanding, that it's our destiny to expand across the continent. But once they expand across the continent, they haven't necessarily settled all the way across the continent, but once they make it across the continent to California and the western coast, it just continues into the Pacific. And so following this expansion to the west, we're going to have an expansion throughout the Pacific Ocean. So the Americans start looking for places, new territories, new raw materials, new places to sell goods. And so they start exploring throughout the Pacific. And one of those major places that they're going to go is going to be Japan. And so in 1853, Commodore Perry arrives in Japan. He's quite a sight when he arrives because he's in these ships with, these steamships with billowing smoke and made out of metal, and people in Japan have never seen anything like this. I mean, they're still living a pretty primitive lifestyle. Commodore Perry meets with the shogun and tries to establish formal relationship. The shogun wants nothing to do with it, so Commodore Perry basically says, I'm going to give you an ultimatum. We're going to leave. We're going to come back in a year, and at that point, we're going to expect you to say yes. So he leaves. A year later, sure enough, he returns, and the shogun basically has no alternative. They need to basically open up to trade with the Americans simply because they don't have the military ability or the military might to try to push them away. So as we said, the Americans are looking for a couple of different things here. They're looking for goods. They're looking for a place to sell their manufactured goods. They're also looking for ports, and they're looking for safe havens, places where they can seek refuge when they need to, or to restock on any kinds of goods that they need, as the American naval power and merchant power starts to expand throughout different parts of the world. So Japan is opened up by the Americans, and the Treaty of Kanagawa formalizes that process. This opens up and allows for 2 ports for American naval capacities during this time period, and also establishes formal diplomatic ties between the Americans and the Japanese. Some major problems are going to arise here, but it's not necessarily problems that arise as a result of these treaties, but problems that are going to arise simply because of the inequalities between the Americans and the Japanese. The Americans are, an industrializing nation, a growing nation, a progressive nation, whereas the Japanese are very much a non-progressive, kind of insulated society that relies heavily on peasant culture and agriculture as a means for producing goods and creating an economy that revolves around that. The Americans are going to need merchants. They're going to need people to buy their goods, and they're going to need people to trade with. And so because of the low status of merchants and the low number of merchants in Japan and the high status of peasants and others and the warrior class, there is an inequality here between these two nations. And so the problems here on this slide really kind of revolve around that idea that the Americans kind of have an upper hand when it comes to all aspects of trade and society during this time period. The result is going to be some unequal treaties, not just between the Americans and the Japanese, but between the Japanese and other European and Asian countries. During this time period, because the Japanese don't have much to offer in return, they end up creating these treaties that really don't allow them a lot of power or control. Part of what I want you to do is look up extraterritoriality, but kind of in a nutshell, just to briefly touch upon this. It's essentially a way for foreigners to have greater powers in a foreign nation. But I do want you to look that one up and kind of answer the question there. But the other aspect of these unequal treaties is the idea that foreign goods are going to be flooding Japan, and the Japanese don't really have a way to counter it. They don't have anything to trade in return. We saw this in China in the Opium War, right? We saw this where you had these unequal treaties and these unequal trade attributes. And so in Japan, we see essentially the same kind of a format playing itself through again. The emperor during the time is referred to as Emperor Meiji. And during this time period, after Commodore Perry comes in, we start to see the shogun pushing against modernization and opening and trying to maintain the status quo. The emperor during this time period really has no powers again. Remember that. The shogun has all the political and economic powers. But the shogun is against change because change is going to represent his failures. He's going to eventually probably lose power, and he knows it, right? The shogun, the Tokugawa shogun during this time period, is in power because of that social structure that we looked at before, where he has all the political power over the samurai class, and the merchants are at the bottom, and the peasants basically are just at the whim of the daimyo and the samurai. And so the shogun is against modernization. But there are some very large landowners, some very large, powerful daimyo, a rising merchant class, and even some peasants and artisans who see the benefits of this trade with Americans and the British. And so they're going to start to push against the shogun to open Japan up to a greater level of modernization. As the more the shogun pushes against it, the greater the power and the push for it. And eventually the shogun will be overthrown and the Emperor Meiji will be reinstated. And this time period is called the Meiji Restoration. Essentially what's going to happen as a result of this is going to be a major turning point. The Meiji Restoration basically represents the turning point between feudal Japan and modern Japan, where we have this rapid change from an agricultural society to an industrial society in Japan. So these are some of the reforms that take place. You can look through these yourself, and I think I have a question or two about this chart as well. But the basic idea here is these Meiji reforms are really modernization reforms. They're all the things that Emperor Meiji puts into place in an attempt to rapidly modernize and industrialize Japan so that they can compete with the Western countries that they're now trading with and interacting with. So at the end of the 19th century, we're going to start to see the rise of Japan as a major world power. A lot of this has to do with their industrial growth, which is going to take place very quickly. But as you have a rising industrial growth, you also have a rising demand for raw materials and new markets to sell your products in. When you have that situation and you're a country like Japan and you have no real raw materials or natural resources of your own, because it's an archipelago with basically agricultural products, their demand or need for raw materials for their industrial base is going to force them to expand. And you basically have two different ways that you can get access to things. You can trade for them or you can take them. The Japanese are going to do a little bit of both, but in their immediate area of Eastern Asia, they're going to also start taking over places so they can have direct access to materials. So we're going to have a series of aggressive acts, small wars or battles that the Japanese are going to wage throughout East Asia through several different methods, but also with a few different countries. So the first one is going to be the Sino-Japanese War, Sino meaning Chinese. So the Sino-Japanese War is going to be between China and Japan. And during this time period, this is when the Japanese are going to get control of much of Manchuria and also temporarily the island of Taiwan. Manchuria eventually is going to become a puppet state. We kind of talked about this when we did China. The last emperor of China was a Manchu himself, and the Japanese are going to work with that emperor to establish the empire of Manchukuo. But essentially what that is really the Japanese having power over the Manchurians and also a foothold and a direct access line into China during World War II. The other major war that takes place here is the Russo-Japanese War between Russia and the Japanese, and this really had to do with some territories. If you look at the eastern parts of Russia and northern parts of Japan, you can see there are some islands there. They share borders between Japan and Russia. Russia is that big. And so there's going to be some conflict over ownership of those islands and the resources that are located there. So we have this war between the Russians and the Japanese. Eventually, the Japanese are going to win that, and they gain access to Korea. So now we have Japanese possession of islands that were once Russian possessions, of Manchuria, which was once a Chinese possession, and now Korea, which was a Korean and or at other times a Chinese possession. So you can start to see the ways in which the Japanese are starting to really kind of grow their power during this time period. So during the 1930s, the Japanese are in the same spot as the rest of the world, suffering under this economic depression that takes place. It's a global depression. It's not an American depression. And what it really pushes the Japanese to do is kind of expand out more rapidly and further to try to gain access to more materials to try to kind of get their economy revved up and going again. So a lot of this has to do under the guise of a free Asia. Keep in mind, many of these Asian countries are colonized by Europeans. And the Japanese essentially are going to enter into a lot of these conflicts and a lot of these wars or these land grabs through the guise of removing Westerners or non-Asians from Asia, and the Japanese coming in almost as like freedom fighters to try to provide people with self-determination. But realistically, it's just one more imperial state taking over from a previous imperial state. So eventually, Japan's going to dominate Asia economically, militaristically, and politically in a lot of different areas, and also islands throughout the South Pacific, which we haven't really touched too much upon. The Second Sino-Japanese War is really World War II in Asia. So the Second Sino-Japanese War is essentially the invasion of China by the Japanese through Manchuria. And this is marked by a time period of great atrocities. These pictures are from Nanking and a time period called the Rape of Nanking, where Japanese soldiers had inflicted some of the most brutal atrocities on Chinese citizens, similar, not exactly the same as, but similar to what we see in Europe between Hitler and groups that are taken over by the Nazis during that time period. But in northern parts of China, we're going to see Japanese power and atrocities during this time period. Eventually, the Japanese are going to join with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy to form this mutual protection pact called the Tripartite Pact, which formally creates the Axis powers during World War II. Of course, the Americans and the British and the French join and ally themselves with what's called the Allied powers, along with the Russians eventually and other groups. But essentially, this sets up this conflict between two sides, the Allies and the Axis powers. Eventually, we have, as you can see on this map, you can see kind of the extent to which the Japanese empire had grown. So this is Japan right in here. These are the islands that were previously Russian possessions that are now Japanese possessions. This is Manchuria, northern China, Southeast Asia, including Indochina, Indonesia, the Philippines, and parts of Papua New Guinea, and then several islands throughout the Pacific Ocean. So the Empire of Japan really expands rapidly and for the same purposes that we were talking about before. Early on, the Americans try an economic embargo to try to cut off supplies, especially war materials and war supplies that the Japanese need. Eventually, the Japanese are going to retaliate against that embargo with an attack on our military and naval installations in Hawaii called Pearl Harbor. This is December 7th, 1941. The Japanese attack the American base in a sneak attack. One day later, we declare war not just on the Japanese, but also on the Germans and formally enter World War II. And it's important that we understand the Americans did not want to enter into World War II. I think that the Japanese really miscalculated on this one. I'm not sure they were looking to get the Americans in. I think they thought it was going to be a pretty easy strike. The Americans were relatively isolationist at this time period. The war had been going on in Europe for a while. The war had been going on in Asia for a while. And Americans really weren't that interested because of our own economic concerns in the United States. But this is, again, a major turning point where the Japanese attack the United States. The United States then emboldens itself and kind of know the rest from there. This map just gives us an idea of how the Americans ended up defeating the Japanese between 1942 and 1945. It really has a lot to do with what's called island hopping. The Americans, if you see the red line here, the red line really demonstrates for us the extent of the Japanese empire. The blue lines represent movement of Allied forces, including the Americans and the British primarily. And you can see, if you follow kind of along the blue lines, how we kind of start off in Hawaii and then just kind of work our way across the Pacific closer and closer to Japan, which is located right up in here. As we get closer to Japan, the Japanese need to start withdrawing from a lot of these other areas to protect themselves, and eventually the Americans are going to overwhelm the Japanese, but it's not a clear-cut idea of how we're going to do that. It's difficult, fighting island to island. Basically, it's fighting months on end to win one island and then moving on to the next island, and that takes months on end, and there's a lot of difficult terrain, a lot of difficult fighting that's going to take place, and the Japanese have proven themselves at this point, as far as the militaristic aspects of this, to be pretty tenacious. And there are a lot of accounts of, we talked about suicide, a lot of suicide attacks that are taking place during this time period, both on land and in the air. And so we have pilots called kamikaze pilots. The word kamikaze means divine wind. And these were pilots who were trained, and there's a video in here if you want to watch it, pilots that were trained specifically to commit suicide, use their planes as a form of weapon to do maximum damage to American and British ships during this time period. Altogether, it's believed there were over 2,000 suicide missions by kamikaze pilots during the war. But even on land, we have people who are committing suicide acts, people who are jumping off cliffs and killing themselves rather than to be taken prisoner or living under American rule. Propaganda plays a huge role in a lot of this as well, where people were told that Americans were essentially cannibalistic, and they were going to come in and they were going to kill women and children and eat them, and all sorts of horrible propagandist type of ideas. And so people were terrified that the Americans were actually going to come in and do evil and commit atrocities themselves. So the United States is faced with a problem. Eventually, they get to the point where it seems inevitable that they're going to have to invade Japan, and this is a process. This is an operation called Operation Olympic, where the idea is, what do we do? If we invade Japan, you can count on millions, or at least 1 million American soldiers probably losing their lives, or other casualties in that process, that there would be a heavy loss of life. The alternative eventually becomes the option of dropping nuclear weapons. So this is the problem that the Americans face. Do we invade, or do we drop these new weapons that we have? Both are going to be devastating. The big problem with the nuclear weapons is it's dropped on a civilian population. It's not a precise target. So you drop it on an industrial base, you drop it on a military base, it's still going to hit other areas. So on August 6, 1945, we dropped the first bomb on Hiroshima. We have to keep in mind that there were a lot of warnings by the Americans to Japanese officials and the Japanese population that we had this bomb, but they didn't believe us. They thought it was all a tactic. So we dropped the bomb August 6th on Hiroshima. We drop leaflets on cities and tell them that we have this bomb and explain what happened before and threaten and warn that we have a second bomb. Nothing happens. 3 days later, we drop a bomb on Nagasaki. Altogether, these bombs resulted in the death of 110,000 civilians, another 130,000 who are going to be injured, and by 1950, another 230,000 people are going to die from their injuries or from lasting effects from the radiation in forms of cancer and other things that will happen. This is a debate that rages on till today. Historians are always going to be debating, should we have dropped the bomb, shouldn't we have dropped the bomb? It's a matter of, was it okay for us to drop a bomb on a civilian population? On one side, you can say yes, because it brought a rapid end to the war, which would have extended and lasted longer with greater number of deaths. That's kind of one of those things where I don't think we'll ever have a clear, decisive answer for that. August 14th, a few days after we dropped the bomb on Nagasaki, the Japanese surrender unconditionally, meaning they don't get to dictate any terms. And on September 2nd, on the USS Missouri, which was anchored in Tokyo Bay, representatives of the Japanese government signed the official treaty. So post-war Japan is really marked by another major turning point. Right, we have rapid development of Japan as a major industrial power during this time period. So all of this comes under kind of the control of the Americans. General MacArthur, who was the main general in the Pacific during this time period, is in charge of post-World War II Japan. And the idea here is to learn from our mistakes in World War I, where we had we basically punished countries that fought against us during that time period. During World War II, it was a clear and concise policy by the Americans to help out our former enemies, to provide them with the ability to have stability. And so in Japan, we did it under these different methods. We disarmed them, took away all their weapons, and the Americans became the basic de facto military for Japan. We provided them with a lot of economic support. We helped them write a democratic society through a democratic constitution that created a society similar to ours, with similar rights as ours. But the biggest thing here is the economic miracle. And the economic miracle is essentially just this time period where Japan went from being a devastated economic archipelago to being one of the world's strongest, probably the second strongest economy in the world by the 1980s. Japan, since 1990, in more modern times, we're going to see some economic decline that took place. Between 1989 and 99, we have a time period called the Lost Decade in Japan. This was a period of constant economic decline in Japan, where a lot of people lost a lot of jobs and suicide rates kind of took off. This was a really bad time period in recent Japanese history. But most of us can sit here and we can think about Japanese products or some other cultural aspect of Japan that impacts our life on a regular basis, whether it be the electronic products that we use, televisions and computers and cell phones or whatever it might be, to anime and other aspects of our cultural lives that we deal with on a regular basis. So Japan has gone through a lot of flux over the last 30, 40 years. They had rapid economic growth, went through a little bit of a decline, but today it's one of the most technologically advanced countries in the world. You can read through these on your own, the major historic, social, and economic themes. You should definitely read through those. They really just kind of do a quick summary of everything that we've talked about. So I'll attach the assignment with this. Make sure that you complete the entire thing and turn that in. I'll give you about a week to work on that, and I'll get it submitted onto Google Classroom. All right. Hope everybody's doing well. Hope to see you all very soon. Miss seeing you guys on a regular basis, and hoping we get back to work, back to school here really quick, and that we don't end the school year. See ya.